Hello, everybody. We're back looking at World War One, the practices of World War One from 1916 to 1917. And so we're going to get started. Make sure you're actively paying attention, taking your notes down, and I'll check your for understanding when you come to class. All right. So when we look at the years of 1916 to 1917, remember, one thing you cannot forget is that we're fighting a war on two fronts here. Germany is fighting a war on two fronts here. You have the Eastern Front and the Western Front. So on the Western Front, two important battles that we want to look at will be the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of Somme. All right. So in Verdun, as you see here, it was an important French fortress town against which the Germans launched this massive attack. All right. And they wanted to draw all the French troops to its defense to destroy them and carry out a final offensive to win the war. All right, but the French general under General Pétain, they defended stubbornly, and in June the Germans had to abandon the attack. All right, the French lost about 315,000 men, and the Germans themselves over about 280,000 men. All right. So in this battle, it was one of the attempts from Germany to try to win the war, encircle France, and capture the army. But uh, it was decisive because General Pétain, all right, they stubbornly refused to give up and fight. All right, even though they suffered high casualties, the Germans ended up abandoning the attack. All right. Now, the Battle of Somme. All right. Now, these were a series of attacks mainly by the British that began on the 1st of July and it lasted through November. All right. There were British and some French forces. Uh, they faced the well-established German positions on the River Somme, which is in France. All right. And one of the things that was significant about this battle is that they aimed to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, and they wanted to take over the trench line as the French army weakened to keep the Germans fully committed. So this was an attempt to really stretch the German army at two different places, locations. All right. Now, this also was an attempt to relieve some pressure on the Eastern Front against Russia. All right. So Germany couldn't send as many men to Russia. All right. British troops found themselves walking into deadly machine gun fire on the very first day. 20,000 were killed and 60,000 more were injured. So we see some alarming statistics with that. And at the end, the Allies made limited advances. All right, there really was no clear-cut winner. All right, but it did sort of have a blow to German morale. Now they started to realize that the British forces were very important to this war, and the fact that it's not going to be a quick, decisive war. Once again, as we keep reiterating. All right. Now, just a couple of key things about this Battle of Somme. There was artillery bombardment that sort of terrified and did destroy the front line position and defenses. All right. There was no element of surprise, of course. We have this idea of trench warfare. And that's sort of what we see here. So when we look at the map here, we have there's Somme, there's the Verdun, all right, and there's Ypres, all right, three key battle sites. Now, at the Battle of Somme, the losses on both sides were sort of appalling, as some people might term. All right, Germans 650,000, British 418,000, and the French 194,000. Now, the generals after this battle came under severe criticism, all right, because of these quick suicidal frontal attacks, meaning they would advance on the enemy, and of course, with this whole idea of the trenches and warfare, a lot of casualties. Now, it was sort of under the assumption, the British and the French assumed that these quick surges, these quick frontal attacks, and infantry charges would break through these trench lines, all right, cause some kind of breakthrough. Remember, this wasn't a war movement, all right, and no one really had any alternative tactics. So we know there were high casualty rates as a result of these frontal attacks, and so the generals were blamed for this high casualty rate, all right. Now, since we had so many troops that died, or the Allies had so many troops that died, the horrors of some contributed to the British Prime Minister Asquith. He was asked to resign, all right, in 1916. All right, so these two battles with the high casualty rates, there was really no Allied victory. Okay? So, David Lloyd George is going to become the British Prime Minister in December 1916. And prior to that, he was the Minister of Munitions, all right, of war, so to speak. And he sort of improved the supply of shells and machine guns. So we're talking about the weaponry is what he was responsible for. All right? And as Prime Minister in 1917, when he did become Prime Minister, he's going to set up this small war cabinet so that we can make quick war decisions because Britain was engaged in war. All right? And he took a lot of uh, industries, as we'll see with war, and he brought them under government control. So shipping and agriculture, all right? And sort of organized the Ministry of National Service to organize the mobilization of men into the army. All right, and also developed this convoy system of for troops. All right, so we started to see some changes in the government and political structure in Britain, but also other countries as well are going to undergo a lot of political changes, and that's going to be one of the effects of this war. All right. So, in the East, let's shift gears to the East. In June 1916, the Russians under Brusilov, they attacked the Austrians. All right, they were pleading to the British and French for help, and and yes, that was the bell. And the British and French for some action to divert German attention away from Verdun. All right. Now, in the East, they did manage to break the front and advance 100 miles, uh, taking 400,000 prisoners and large amounts of equipment. Now, the Austrians, they were weak. Remember, when we think back to our war chart that we did a couple class periods ago, we do know that the Austrians did not have as many military personnel as the other uh, countries, all right, or the other Central Powers. All right, so the strain sort of was exhausting to both the Austrians and the Russians. So the Romanians ended up invading Austria, and the Germans of course, came to their rescue. But Austria is sort of weakening, and Russia is sort of defeating a lot of battles against Austria. All right. So World War I was also characterized as a war at sea. Now the Allies aimed to use their navy in three ways. One, very important that you note this. They wanted to blockade the Central Powers. They wanted to prevent goods from entering or leaving, and they slowly started to starve out the enemy. All right, and we're going to look at that a little bit later and what that actually means. They wanted to keep trade routes open between Britain and her empire, so the rest of the world, so that the Allies themselves would not starve. So remember, Britain had a very strong navy, and the Germans were building up their navy leading up to World War I when we talked about militarization. So they also wanted to transport British troops to the continent and keep them supplied via the Channel ports. All right. Now the British were very successful in carrying out these three aims, especially against Germany. All right. So the Allied blockade caused problems. All right. This blockade, Britain was trying to prevent the Germans from using neutral Scandinavian ports to break the blockade. All right, so this means that it involved searching and stopping all neutral ships and confiscating any goods suspected of being intended for enemy hands. All right, now the USA, of course, is neutral at this point, and they're going to object to this. All right, because they wanted to continue trade with both sides. All right, so the USA were neutral; they didn't take sides. So this was sort of one of those things that sort of started to tick the U.S. into a certain direction. All right. Now, most German surface vessels had either been destroyed or were blockaded in their port. They really couldn't leave. Now, Germany did respect the neutral shipping and passenger liners. All right. Now, the Germans, they have their U-boat or the submarine. All right, and that blockade sort of was not effective. All right. Now, they had insufficient U-boats, and their problems, and there were problems, with identification. How could we respect a neutral country if we didn't know if the ship was neutral? All right, and so of course the British tried to fool the Germans by flying neutral flags and by using passenger liners to transport arms and ammunition. All right. So one example that we're going to see, or you're going to you see here, we in April 1915, the British liner Lusitania was sunk by a torpedo by the German U-boat. All right. And actually, in fact, the Lusitania was armed and carrying vast quantities of arms and ammunition, and the Germans knew that. All right. But the Lusitania did have a significant number of they had a number of American passengers. All right. There you see a picture of the German U-boat, all right, the submarine Germans used. All right. Now, the Germans claimed that the sinking was not an act of, barbarism, against defenseless civilians. Now, the consequences. Out of almost 2,000 dead, 128 were Americans. So there were Americans aboard the Lusitania. Um, President Wilson, the President of the United States, decided that they would take sides to protect trade. All right. Now, these German tactics, did interfere with safety of passengers and crews. Um, so when America started to protest, this caused the Germans to sort of tone down their submarine campaign which made it, of course, less effective. Now, the Battle of Jutland. This was one of the main battles at sea during 1916. All right. This was the only time in which the main battle fleets from both sides were directly engaged in war. All right. More British ships came out than had anticipated, and after the two fleets had shelled each other on and off for several hours, the Germans decided to retire to base and firing torpedoes as they went. The Germans at the end of this battle lost 11 ships. The British lost 14. Now, the significance, what you really want to take away from the Battle of Jutland. The real importance of the battle is the fact that Germany had failed to destroy British sea power. And this is going to sort of be one of the reasons that the war is sort of going to slowly come to an end. All right. Now, Britain remained in control. In desperation at the food shortage caused by the British blockade, the Germans embarked on unrestricted submarine warfare. Very important here that you note this key bullet. All right. Because now that the Germans failed to sort of destroy the British sea power or the ships, it's going to cause Britain to be sort of at an advantage because now they're able to starve out, quote unquote, the enemy or Germans. All right. They're able to control what's going in and out. And so it made it very hard for Germans to get any food and supplies to its soldiers. All right. So Germany sort of responded with this unrestricted warfare. Now we're just going to fight all out. All right. So it was a result of Germany concentrating on the production of U-boats since the Battle of Jutland, as you see here. All right. So the Germans attempted to sink all enemy and neutral merchant ships in the Atlantic. All right. Now they knew this was likely to bring the United States into war, and they hoped that Britain and France would be starved into war before the Americans could sort of make any vital contributions. So they sort of hoped that by the end of this, that Britain and France would be sort of depleted of all its resources before the USA could actually make a difference. All right, so it did have some sort of success, which came in 1917 when there were about 430 ships were lost. All right, so that's when Lord George, and I mentioned this earlier, adopted the convoy system. All right, a large number of merchant ships that sort of sailed together so that they could be escorted and protected by warships. So that's when he sort of implemented that. And I did mention that earlier. That's what the convoy system was. All right, submarine warfare was important because it did directly bring the U.S. into the war. Okay, so in the West, 1917 was sort of characterized as the year of Allied failure. There wasn't a lot of significant advances. From June to November, the British fought the Third Battle of Ypres, which of course they lost more casualties. And then the Battle of Cambrai, all right, demonstrated that tanks, and this is key to know about this battle, all right, that tanks, if used properly, could break the deadlock of trench warfare. Key point, note this, very important, all right. So 381 massed British tanks made a great break in the German line. All right. um, but they didn't have the reserves, which prevented any future success to follow up. But the Battle of Cambrai became the model for successful Allied attacks of 1918 that will come later. All right, so tanks, that was the key to breaking this whole trench warfare. Now, in 1917, on the Eastern Front, Russia is going to withdraw from the war. All right, there's Russian Revolution that's sort of going on, and we'll look at that a little bit later when you come to class. But as a result, there are continued heavy losses at the hands of Germans. All right, they lacked arms and supplies, problems of transportation and communications, and leadership that caused two revolutions in Russia. All right, um, Tsar Nicholas II, he lost the confidence of the Russian military, the industrial, and political leaders. All right, and so the Bolsheviks, later known as the Communists, are going to come to power in November. Um, Sort of made peace with the people rebelling against the leadership. All right, because there was so much unrest at home. All right, and one example, people were protesting against the government, and soldiers would not fire on the people. All right, and this sort of was what caused the overthrow of the government. All right, and we'll look at the Russian Revolution a little bit when you come to class. In 1918, the entire weight of German forces could be thrown against the West as a result of Russia withdrawing. All right. Now, USA is going to enter the war. This was partly by the German U-boat campaign, and also by, and I know you know this from prior classes, about the discovery that Germany was trying to persuade Mexico to declare war on the USA. Okay, promising Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in return. All right, and we know that from the Zimmerman telegram. All right, the USA made an important contribution to the Allied victory. They supplied, Britain and France with food, merchant ships, and credit, though actual military help came slowly. All right, by end of 1917, only one American division had been in action, but by mid 1918, over 500,000 men were involved. So we see slowly the USA is going to come into the war. So we see part because of Lusitania, part because of this whole Zimmerman telegram. All right, so we want to look at some key features that sort of encompass the whole war. One was that sometimes many historians coin this war as a war of attrition. All right, neither side found it possible to achieve a decisive outcome on the battlefield, so they decided to wear out the enemy by draining its men of its resources. So remember, we talked about starving out the enemy, blocking the supply lines for the troops. All right, and the war at sea saw few decisive victories and was characterized by blockades, see that twice, and attacks on merchant ships. Weapons were more destructive and more varied than previously. And of course, we talked about, you saw that presentation on gas, flamethrowers, aircraft, huge artillery, and more developed machine guns. Artillery was larger and more precise, and air power became advanced beyond primitive combat as the war progressed. Submarines, U-boats, tanks were a major military development in the Battle of Cambrai. All right, you had much larger armies. Casualties were higher. All right, and you're going to see, and when we talk about the effects, the whole population was involved in the war. The state controlled the people and the resources of every country to a greater extent. All right. So there you have it, my friends. Some of the key battles of the war. All right.